My name is Praveen Singh Rawat. I'm an Azure evangelist in Microsoft. Welcome to this video. So behind me, you see two very heavily loaded terms. And these terms have been loaded and used for many years now. The first one is SaaS, which stands for Software as a Service. Any thought leader would tell us that the only way to efficiently deliver software to customers in this modern era is SaaS. The second term that you see on my whiteboard is cloud. This is the delivery platform of choice. This is where the innovation is happening, provision is fast, compute can be bought on demand, etc., etc. So what if we had to combine these two? What if you were an independent software vendor that were planning on developing a software as service solution that could be quickly provisioned? It could leverage the efficiencies of the cloud, particularly the efficiencies in Azure. That is the theme of this video. Hopefully, you would have a good refresher on the basic concepts behind SaaS, just as a checklist to make sure that you don't miss anything while architecting and designing your product. And of course, the context is going to be the Azure cloud. So we have the agenda behind us in my whiteboard. I'll start off very quickly by refreshing on some of the financial objectives that we are trying to meet while building out the service. We'll just touch upon capital expenditure and total cost of ownership at a very high level. After that, we'll jump on to the product side and talk about implementing a tiered approach to billing your customers, having this tiered approach baked into your product. Finally, we'll wrap up by talking about some of the architectural design principles such as automation and secure shared infrastructure that you will need to consider from the very start. The first major point is low Capex. If you are an independent software vendor, a software company selling software to a customer, you don't want the customer to pay a large upfront cost. The higher the upfront cost, the higher you will have to go up in the organizational hierarchy to close the deal. The SaaS delivery model puts your service in the hands of developers, departments who can now afford to use your service within their budgets. So that brings us to the second point of empowerment. The more people you empower, the better chances you have of scaling your service out. So of course, then the last point is OpEx. That's how you make money. In a true software as service, ideally, you want to have zero Capex, and then you want to have monthly expenditure, which is operating expense, OpEx. And that OpEx is going to be associated with your subscription, what you have signed up for. The second principle is low TCO, or low total cost of ownership. Corporations, potential customers, are already burdened with ownership of their existing infrastructure that's lying in their data centers. Most likely, they have already been strategically tasked at the executive level to drive down this TCO. So let's help them do that. Let's not increase the burden. And you can do that by delivering software as services, because here now you host the infrastructure, you handle the underlying infrastructure in a multi-tenant fashion, and you also provide interfaces that the customer can use to engage with the product. So these interfaces can be applications, they can be APIs, but what's important is that the customer should be able to, interface seamlessly. They should have a single sign-on experience. They should be able to authenticate using their existing corporate credentials. So you have to make this experience seamless, and so then they can easily interface with your product. The next principle is providing a tiered approach to billing your customer, and doing so with flexible plans. So think of music stations such as Pandora, Spotify, etc. They have a freemium or free tier that they use to hook a base of users. A portion of these users eventually move on to a paid tier. The commercial product that you sell to your customers, the software as service, this can also be designed in a very similar fashion. So again, you can use a free trial to build out that ecosystem of developers to create a brand name. And once these developers have tried out your product and they're ready to move on to the paid tier, at that stage you can use different offerings to give them a different selection of offerings. Now, how do you design all this? Remember that as a software as service provider, you are billing the customer while you're also paying the underlying infrastructure provider or the cloud. Remember that Azure will bill you based on the services that you consume and the usage of those services. So you can use that information that you have, and you can also use different strategies such as bundling to create that product offering. Let me give you an example. So let's take an example that the developers of a large enterprise have tried out your services, and now they want to decide what they want to subscribe to. So one tier could be, let's say, a standard tier where you provide compute. So you say you want to run your workloads. Great, so that's the standard tier. But if you also want to do advanced analytics on your data, if you also want to use the more expensive services such as machine learning, data warehousing, well, in that case, you might want to leverage the more expensive premium tier. So that's a basic example of how you could design your product offering. The next principle of software as services is automation of provisioning. When I say provisioning, I'm talking about two kinds of provisioning. So this could be provisioning your entire software as service to a brand new customer tenant, or we could be talking about provisioning a new environment, such as replicating your development environment into a QA environment with some different configuration, but essentially the same set of resources. So You want to be able to leverage the automation that the cloud provides. In Azure, you have the concept of ARM, which stands for Azure Resource Manager. So ARM provides you a declarative way of defining your infrastructure and the dependencies between the components. So you can define the entire fabric of your software as service declaratively using JSON format. And then you can use that to replicate that service across different customer tenants or different environments, of course, each having its own unique configuration. Now, if you want to evaluate how deep under the water you are, then you can ask yourself the basic question, how much time does it take you to provision your service to a completely new customer? The answer could be hours, days, weeks. I know a case where the answer was more than a month. Well, the more time it takes you to provision your service to a new customer, the farther away you are from the software as service delivery model. If you ask Microsoft the exact same question, how much time does it take Microsoft to provision, let's say, SharePoint Online to a new customer, then the answer would be you just type in your information, your configuration, and you're done. You can start using the service. That's a true software as service, and that's the direction in which you want to head towards. When you architect a multi-tenant software as service application, keep shared infrastructure in mind from the very start. This might not be in mind when you are provisioning your service to the first few customers. The easy way out for the very first few customers might be to deploy your service as a single tenant service to these customers, which means each customer gets their own instance of your service, as in their own web tier, app tier, as well as data tier. But once your service becomes more and more popular, and let's say that you have 50 enterprise customers, maybe hundreds of enterprise customers, you'll very quickly realize that you're spending way too much money, and the cost of producing and keeping your services up is just too expensive. Don't forget that if you can keep your operating costs low, then you can also pass on the cost benefits to your customers, and you can keep the price of your product more competitive. So, well, yes, we do want to focus on shared infrastructure. At the same time, we also need to focus on compliance. Many customers might tell you that we love your software as service. Can we have a dedicated instance of that? Because we have to adhere to compliance regulations. Well, two things. First of all, most of the services on Azure are compliant with a host of stringent compliance regulations, and many of these services are multi-tenant shared managed services. So these building blocks can be used to build compliant systems. And secondly, even though you want to be compliant, you can be compliant in a multi-tenant shared infrastructure architecture. Let's take an example. A very common compliance requirement is the need to keep customer data isolated and resident in a certain region. Now, all of that can be done. So, for example, in this simple architecture, the web tier can be shared, the app tier can be shared, And we can provision a separate, isolated, dedicated database for each customer. So we can satisfy that requirement. Of course, there may be scenarios where you still want to spin up a dedicated instance of your service for, let's say, a pretty large customer that have exceptionally large intensive bandwidth and compute requirements. Then in that case, you might want to spin up that dedicated instance so that it does not impact other customer instances. So when you are onboarding a new customer, do the due diligence and do the proper analysis before you decide on a single tenant, shared multi-tenant, or a fully multi-tenant architecture. Thanks for watching this video. This was more of a primer video talking about the fundamentals of SaaS or software as service applications. Feel free to subscribe to this channel. Subsequent videos will be talking about actual solutions that we can build on Azure. So in those videos, I will walk through envisioning architecture and hands-on demos of building out SaaS applications on Azure.